The fluorescent lights in St. Margaret's Hospital always flickered just before midnight. I'd grown used to it during my years working the graveyard shift in the psychiatric wing, but tonight the stuttering glow felt different, more deliberate, as if trying to communicate something in Morse code. That I was reviewing patient files at the nurse's station when Sarah, one of our newest night nurses, approached with a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. Her hands trembled slightly as she set it down. "Dr. Bennett, there's something wrong with the patient in room 307. Her voice cracked on the last word. He won't stop smiling." Room 307 had been empty since yesterday morning. I distinctly remembered signing the discharge papers myself. The security monitors showed static in place of the room 307 feed. Static wasn't unusual in our aging facility, but the way it pulsed in regular intervals made my skin crawl. I grabbed my tablet and badge, trying to ignore the way the shadows seemed to elongate as I walked down the corridor. The night shift had always played tricks on my mind, the way darkness transforms familiar spaces into something alien and threatening. But tonight, every footstep echoed with an unsettling resonance, as if the sound was returning from somewhere much further away than the ceiling above. Room 307's door was slightly ajar, though I was certain it had been locked after discharge. A thin strip of darkness leaked out into the hallway, darker somehow than the dimmed corridor itself. The air grew thick, carrying the metallic scent of copper pennies left too long in the sun. My hand hesitated on the door handle. Through the gap, I could hear something, not breathing, exactly, but the suggestion of breath, like the space between heartbeats stretched into sound. The door swung open with a whisper of well-oiled hinges. The room beyond was dark, but not empty. In the far corner, a figure sat perfectly still in one of our standard-issue chairs. The ambient light from the hallway caught the edges of what appeared to be surgical gauze wrapped around its head, discolored with age or something worse. "Sir." My voice sounded thin in the dense air. "This room is supposed to be vacant. I'll need to." The figure's head turned with an unnatural smoothness, like a camera pivot. In the darkness, I could make out the suggestion of a smile, not one made of joy or even malice, but something deeper and more primordial. It was the kind of smile that existed before humans knew what smiling meant. "Doctor," it whispered, in a voice that seemed to come from everywhere except the figure itself. "I've been waiting for your shift to begin." The lights in the hallway chose that moment to flicker, and in that fractional darkness, I saw the figure move. Not toward me, but wrong, like watching a spider crawl on fast forward. When the light stabilized, it was standing inches from my face. Up close, I could see that what I'd thought was surgical gauze was actually skin, scarred and rippled like wax that had melted and rehardened countless times. The smile stretched impossibly wide, and in the depths of its dark eyes, I saw reflections of things that hadn't happened. It leaned forward, close enough that I should have felt breath on my face, but there was only a void of sensation, and whispered a single word. "Sleep." I woke up in my office with the taste of copper in my mouth and 6 hours missing from my memory. The digital clock on my desk blinked 6:13 a.m., its red numerals accusatory in the gray pre-dawn light. My neck ached from an awkward sleeping position, but something about the pain felt wrong, too precise, like pressure points pressed by knowing fingers. The events in room 307 played through my mind with the fuzzy uncertainty of a fever dream. I reached for my tablet to check the security footage, but my hands froze mid-motion. There, beneath my fingernails, were thin crescents of dried blood. My office door creaked open before I could process this discovery. Sarah stood in the doorway, her face pale beneath the morning's fluorescent glare. "Dr. Bennett? We need you in the East Wing. There's been an incident." The walk to the East Wing felt longer than usual, each step echoing with a hollow resonance that seemed to follow a fraction of a second too late. Sarah's shoes squeaked against the linoleum in an arrhythmic pattern that made my teeth ache. "3 patients," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "All found in their beds this morning, all." She swallowed hard, all smiling. The first patient's room held the lingering scent of antiseptic and something sweeter, like overripe fruit. Mrs. Callahan, a 67-year-old recovering from routine hip surgery, lay peacefully in her bed. Her face was frozen in an expression of such profound joy that it took me a moment to realize she wasn't breathing. The second and third rooms told the same story. Different patients, different ages, different reasons for being in our care, but identical expressions of ecstasy carved into lifeless faces. The morgue would later report that they died of heart failure, all within minutes of each other, despite being in different rooms on different floors. Back in my office, I pulled up the patient database with trembling fingers. A pattern emerged that turned my blood to ice water. All 3 victims had been previous occupants of room 307. The records showed something else, something impossible. Every patient who had ever stayed in room 307 had been discharged or transferred, their files marked with a single recurring note: patient exhibited unusual facial tics and persistent smiling behavior prior to release. My computer screen flickered, and in that brief darkness, I saw a reflection that wasn't my own. A face wrapped in rippled skin, that impossible smile stretching wider as I spun around to confront empty air. A new file had opened on my screen. Security footage from last night, showing me entering room 307. I watched myself step through that door, but the feed cut to static before showing me leave. The timestamp showed I had been in that room for exactly 6 hours and 13 minutes. That's when I noticed my smile in the reflection of the black screen. It wouldn't go away, no matter how hard I tried to relax my face. My cheeks began to ache, and somewhere in the building, I heard the whisper of well-oiled hinges. "Sleep," said a voice behind me, and this time, I recognized it as my own. The bathroom mirror in my office had become an enemy. Each glance revealed subtle changes I couldn't quite catalog, a slight asymmetry to my smile, a darkness behind my eyes that seemed to pulse with its own rhythm. My reflection blinked once, twice, 3 times, though I was certain I hadn't moved. The morning's investigation into the deaths had sparked a hospital-wide review. I sat in meetings where administrators spoke in hushed tones about liability and procedure, their voices distorting into meaningless sounds that reminded me of insects scratching beneath bark. My notes from these sessions, when I reviewed them later, contained nothing but the word "sleep" written in increasingly erratic script, bleeding through page after page. That afternoon, I found myself drawn to the hospital's archives, a maze of dimly lit shelves in the sub-basement where the air hung thick with the musty breath of aging paper. The fluorescent lights here hummed at a frequency that made my teeth vibrate, casting shadows that seemed to move independently of any source. I traced the history of room 307 through decades of blueprints and maintenance records. The room shouldn't have existed. In the original hospital plans, that space was marked as a solid wall, a structural support between wings. Yet there it stood, had always stood, accepting patients year after year who left wearing identical smiles. A shuffle of movement caught my attention. Sarah stood at the end of the row, her uniform crisp despite the late hour. "Dr. Bennett? Are you feeling well? The night shift begins in 20 minutes. Something about her voice struck me as wrong. It held too many frequencies, like multiple people speaking in perfect unison. When she tilted her head, the motion reminded me of security footage played in reverse. "Your smile," she said, taking a step closer. "It's perfect now. Just like his." I backed away, knocking over a shelf of records. Papers scattered across the floor, and in their falling dance, I saw patterns forming, faces, all wearing that same stretched grin, their eyes hollow with a joy that had nothing to do with happiness. The lights flickered, and in that strobing darkness, I saw Sarah's face shift. The skin beneath her eyes rippled like disturbed water, and her smile, that terrible, familiar smile, stretched past the natural boundaries of her face. She reached for me with fingers that seemed too long, too jointed. "He's been waiting for someone like you," she whispered in that multi-layered voice. "Someone who could help him smile at everyone. All at once. Forever." I ran. Through the archives, up emergency stairs that felt endless, my footsteps echoing back at me from impossible angles. But every floor I reached, every corridor I turned down, held another familiar face distorted by that unnatural smile. Patients, staff, visitors, all turned toward me with synchronized movement, their eyes reflecting the same darkness I'd seen growing in my own. I found myself back at room 307. The door stood open, inviting, the darkness beyond it deeper than any shadow should be. On the wall beside it, a simple plastic plaque caught my eye. I'd seen it countless times before, but now the letters shifted as I watched, rearranging themselves into words that made my heart stutter. Dr. Bennett's office, Chief of Psychiatric Services. How long had that been there? How long had I been here? And why couldn't I remember ever being anywhere else? From the darkness within, I heard my own voice whisper, "Welcome home." Memory becomes liquid in the dark hours before dawn. I found myself in the hospital's record room again, though I couldn't remember descending the stairs. The air held that peculiar stillness unique to underground spaces, a thickness that suggested the weight of earth above, pressing down with patient inevitability. My flashlight beam caught dust motes that danced like dying stars, each one casting prismatic shadows that shouldn't have been possible. The beam illuminated row after row of patient files, their manila folders discolored with age, edges curled like dying leaves. Some bore dates from before my birth, before the hospital's construction, before. The thought slipped away like water through cupped hands. A file caught my eye, something about its placement seemed deliberate, as if it had been waiting for me. The label read, Bennett, James, attending physician, in my own handwriting, though I had no memory of creating it. The date stamp showed 1973. My father's name had been James. With trembling fingers, I opened the file. Photographs spilled out, scattering across the floor like autumn leaves. Each one showed the same scene, room 307, photographed at different angles, in different decades. The room remained unchanged while the hospital aged around it, a constant point in shifting reality. In every image, barely visible in the corner, stood a figure with gauze-wrapped features and that impossible smile. And in every image, my father stood in the doorway, his own smile growing wider with each successive photograph, his features gradually taking on that same stretched quality I now saw in my own reflection. The last photograph was different. It showed my father seated at his desk, writing in a journal. The date stamp read one day before his disappearance. I'd been told he abandoned his practice, left our family, started a new life somewhere else. But the image suggested something else, something worse. The journal itself lay beneath the photographs, its leather cover cracked and peeling. The pages contained patient notes written in my father's precise hand, documenting the slow transformation of room 307's occupants. The entries grew more erratic over time, the handwriting degrading into something frantic and spidery. The final entry chilled my blood, "It doesn't want to cure them. It wants to perfect them." And now I understand why. The smile is not a symptom, it's evolution. We're becoming what we were always meant to be. I can see it now, in all the faces around me. So beautiful. So complete. My son will understand when he's ready. When he smiles too. A sound behind me, the whisper of well-oiled hinges. I turned to find Sarah standing there, though something about her movement suggested she'd been there all along, waiting for me to notice. Her smile had evolved since our last encounter, stretching past her ears in elegant curves that reminded me of Arabic calligraphy. "Your father left such detailed notes," she said, her voice harmonizing with others I couldn't see. "He helped us understand how to wait, how to prepare. How to make each smile perfect." She gestured to the walls, and I realized the filing cabinets had become mirrors, each one reflecting a different version of my face, caught in various stages of transformation. "Would you like to see his smile now?" she asked. "He's been waiting in room 307. They all have. Waiting for you to join the conversation that never ends." From somewhere above, I heard the hospital's PA system crackle to life. In my father's voice, it whispered, "Sleep." Time becomes elastic in St. Margaret's corridors after midnight. I found myself wandering through passages that shouldn't exist, where the fluorescent lights cast shadows in impossible directions and the linoleum floor rippled like the surface of a disturbed pond. Every reflection I passed showed a slightly different version of my face, each smile stretched a fraction wider than the last. The patient files I discovered about my father weighed heavy in my hands, though when I looked down, I saw only my own fingers elongating, joints multiplying like spreading fractures. The skin across my knuckles had begun to take on that familiar rippled texture, like wax that had melted and rehardened countless times. A sound drew me deeper into the hospital's maze, a rhythmic tapping that reminded me of fingernails on glass. Following it led me to a door I'd never noticed before, tucked into an alcove where two corridors met at an angle that hurt my eyes to look at directly. The nameplate read, "Archive Annex," but the letters seemed to squirm beneath my gaze, occasionally resolving into other words: memory storage, smile collection, welcome home. Inside, the room stretched far beyond what the hospital's exterior dimensions should allow. Row upon row of glass cases lined the walls, each containing what appeared to be a smile, just the lips and teeth, preserved somehow, floating in clear fluid that caught the light like oil on water. Each was labeled with a date and a name. I recognized some of them, former patients, colleagues, faces from my father's photographs. At the far end of the room stood a mirror that reflected nothing of the space around me. Instead, it showed room 307 as it had appeared in different decades simultaneously, images overlapping like double-exposed photographs. In each layer, I saw the figure with the gauze-wrapped face standing in exactly the same spot, its smile constant across time. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Sarah's voice came from everywhere and nowhere. "Each smile is a doorway. A moment of perfect transformation captured forever." She stepped out of the mirror as if emerging from deep water, her movements liquid and wrong. "Your father understood. He helped us collect them, preserve them, prepare them for what comes next." "What comes next?" My voice sounded strange in my ears, harmonizing with itself in impossible ways. "The final smile," she said, gesturing to an empty case in the center of the room. The label bore my name and today's date. "The one that will connect all the others. Through you, through room 307, through every reflection in every window of every building in this city. We'll smile together, all of us, forever." The glass cases began to vibrate, their contents writhing with anticipation. In their curved surfaces, I saw my reflection multiplied 1,000 times, each version of me wearing a smile that belonged to someone else. The air grew thick with the taste of copper and old memories. From the mirror behind Sarah, a figure emerged, my father, his face transformed into something that barely remembered being human, his smile a perfect curve that defied the limitations of flesh. He reached for me with hands that had too many fingers, each joint bending in newfound directions. "Son," he said, in a voice that echoed with every smile ever collected, "it's time to complete the family album." The lights flickered, and in that moment of darkness, I felt something press against my lips, something that whispered of home and belonging and the perfect geometry of joy stretched beyond breaking. The hospital's basement levels had always been a labyrinth, but tonight they stretched beyond any rational architecture. I fled deeper into their depths, away from my father's distorted form, away from Sarah's liquid movements, away from the archive of collected smiles. Each turn led me through spaces that belonged to different decades, sometimes the walls were modern drywall, sometimes exposed brick from the 1950s, sometimes rough-hewn stone that predated the hospital's construction. The air grew thicker as I descended, carrying the weight of accumulated memories and discarded smiles. My flashlight beam caught strange formations on the walls. At first glance they appeared to be pipes or electrical conduits, but closer inspection revealed them to be veins, pulsing softly with a light that had never seen the sun. They converged and diverged in patterns that reminded me of neural networks, or perhaps the blueprint of something vast and patient. I found myself in a circular chamber that couldn't exist within the hospital's foundation. The ceiling arched away into darkness, supported by columns that looked like stretched human forms, their faces turned upward in expressions of perpetual ecstasy. The floor was a mosaic of mirrors, each reflecting a different version of reality. Some showed the hospital as it existed now, others as it had been decades ago, and still others revealed possibilities that hadn't happened yet. In the center stood a pedestal of twisted marble that resembled a spinal column. Atop it sat my father's journal, though it had changed since I'd last seen it in the archives. The pages had multiplied, spilling over the edges like falling leaves, each one covered in diagrams and notations that described the geometry of perfect smiles. They detailed the exact angles needed to stretch human joy beyond its natural limits, the precise calculations required to transform a simple expression into a doorway. The mathematics of happiness, my father's voice echoed from everywhere at once. I spent years trying to understand it. Why some smiles opened doors while others remained merely human. The answer was so simple, in the end. He emerged from between the columns, his movements suggesting joints that had been reimagined by something that had never worn flesh. His smile had evolved beyond anything I'd seen in the archives collection. It was less an expression now and more a window into somewhere else, a place where geometry obeyed different laws. It's not about the muscles or the bones, he continued, gesturing with two long fingers that left traces in the air like heat distortions. It's about finding the exact point where human expression intersects with something older. Something that was here before we learned to shape our faces into signs of emotion. The veins on the walls pulsed faster, their light taking on a rhythmic quality that matched the beat of my increasingly erratic heart. In the mirror floor beneath my feet, I saw my own reflection fragmenting into countless versions of myself, some still mostly human, others transformed into something that understood smiles in a way that flesh was never meant to comprehend. Sarah emerged from one of these reflections, rising through the glass as if it were water. She carried something in her hands, a mask made of what appeared to be stretched skin and preserved smiles, sewn together into a collage of joy that defied natural law. Your father's greatest contribution, she said, her voice harmonizing with frequencies that hurt to hear. He learned how to combine them, you see. How to take the perfect moments of transformation from different smiles and weave them into something new. Something that could bridge the gap between what we are and what we're becoming. The mask in her hands writhed slightly, the smiles that composed it shifting and realigning themselves like the pieces of a living puzzle. I recognized some of them, patients from room 307, colleagues who had disappeared over the years, faces from old photographs that had hung in the hospital's corridors. But it was never complete, my father said, moving closer in ways that ignored normal space. It needed something else. Someone who could understand both sides of the transformation. A doctor who could see the beauty in what others called madness. A son who inherited not just my position, but my potential. The veins on the walls converged suddenly, forming a pattern that I recognized with horrifying clarity. It was a smile, drawn building-sized across the chamber's architecture. And in its curve, I saw the truth about room 307, about the hospital, about my father's research. This place wasn't just collecting smiles. It was building something. A door. A way through. And I was the key that would turn the last lock. Some truths exist in the spaces between heartbeats, in the moments when reality holds its breath. As I stood in that impossible chamber beneath St. Margaret's, watching the living veins pulse across ancient stone, I felt something fundamental shifting in my understanding of what a smile could be. The mask in Sarah's hands had begun to sing. Not with sound, exactly, but with something that resonated in the hollow spaces behind my teeth. Each preserved smile that composed its surface vibrated at its own frequency, creating a harmony that made my vision blur at the edges. The combined effect was like hearing a symphony performed by instruments that had never existed. Your father discovered that every smile has its own signature, Sarah whispered, her voice threading through the mask's strange music. A unique frequency that opens different doors. But combining them. She traced one finger along the mask's surface, and the smiles rippled in response like disturbed water. Combining them creates possibilities that humanity was never meant to explore. My father moved closer, his form suggesting geometries that Euclidean mathematics had never dreamed of. The smile that split his face had evolved even further. It now seemed less like an expression and more like a window into somewhere else, a place where joy had been dissected and reassembled by something that had never worn flesh. I started small, he said, gesturing to the mirror floor beneath our feet. In its reflective surface, I saw scenes from decades past, my father in his prime, working late nights in room 307, carefully documenting each patient's transformation. Just trying to understand why some smiles seemed more receptive than others. Why certain patients could see the beauty waiting on the other side. The scenes shifted, showing years of meticulous research. I watched my father collecting smiles like precious specimens, preserving them in solutions that defied normal chemistry. Each one was carefully catalogued, their properties documented in that journal whose pages now scattered across the chamber floor like autumn leaves made of human skin. But it wasn't enough to just collect them, he continued, his movements leaving afterimages in the air that smiled independently of his face. They needed to be perfected. Combined. Transformed into something that could bridge the gap between what we are and what's waiting to welcome us. The veins on the walls pulsed faster now, their light taking on a quality that hurt to look at directly. They formed patterns that reminded me of neural networks, or perhaps the blueprint of something vast and patient, a smile stretched across the architecture of reality itself. Sarah stepped forward, the mask in her hands writhing with increasing urgency. Your father prepared everything, laid the groundwork over decades. But the final piece. She held the mask higher, and I saw my own reflection fractured across its surface, each smile contributing a different version of my face. The final piece needed to be someone who could understand both sides. A doctor who could see the beauty in what others called madness. A son who inherited not just position, but potential. The chamber around us began to shift, the columned figures turning their eternally smiling faces toward me with synchronized grace. The mirror floor beneath rippled like disturbed mercury, reflecting possibilities that existed just beyond normal perception. In each reflection, I saw different versions of myself, some still mostly human, others transformed into something that understood smiles in ways that flesh was never meant to comprehend. My father approached, holding something that caught the pulsing light like polished bone. It was a key, though not one made for any lock I recognized. Its surface was carved with expressions of joy taken to mathematical extremes, each curve and angle calculated to open doors that shouldn't exist. Room 307 was never just a room, he said, his voice harmonizing with frequencies that made my bones vibrate. It's a threshold. A place where the geometry of human expression intersects with something older. Something that was here before we learned to shape our faces into signs of emotion. The key in his hands began to warm, its carved surfaces moving like liquid metal. The smiles etched into its surface writhed with a life of their own, reaching toward me with an eagerness that made my skin crawl. Every smile we collected, every patient we helped transform, they were all preparation for this moment, Sarah said, moving closer with the mask. The door is ready. It just needs someone to turn the key. Someone who understands the mathematics of joy. The veins on the walls converged suddenly, forming a pattern that I recognized with horrifying clarity. It was a smile, drawn building-sized across the chamber's architecture. And in its curve, I saw the truth about everything, room 307, the hospital, my father's research. This place wasn't just collecting smiles. It was building something. A door. A way through. And as the mask drew closer to my face, its surface alive with generations of preserved smiles, I felt my own expression beginning to change. Not because of muscles or bones, but because something on the other side of that door was finally teaching me how to smile properly. After all, joy is infectious. And some infections are meant to spread. There are moments when reality holds its breath, when the space between heartbeats stretches into infinity. As Sarah pressed the mask of collected smiles against my face, I felt the weight of generations of transformed joy settling into my skin. Each preserved smile seemed to pulse with its own life, whispering secrets about the nature of happiness that human minds were never meant to comprehend. The chamber's mirrored floor rippled beneath us like disturbed mercury, reflecting countless versions of this moment, some where I resisted, others where I embraced the transformation with terrifying eagerness. The carved key in my father's hands had begun to sing, its surface writhing with expressions that defied the limitations of flesh and bone. "The door has always been here," my father whispered, his voice harmonizing with frequencies that made my teeth ache. Room 307 was just the smallest part of it, a keyhole glimpsed through human perception. But now, he gestured to the walls where the living veins pulsed in patterns that suggested something vast and patient watching through the architecture itself. The mask melded with my skin, each preserved smile finding its place in my own expression. I felt them settling into my flesh like memories of joy that belonged to someone else, teaching my face new ways to curve and stretch. The sensation was beyond pain, beyond pleasure, it was like learning a language that existed before humans had mouths to speak. Sarah's form had begun to shift, her movements suggesting geometries that Euclidean mathematics had never dreamed of. "Your father prepared the way," she said, her voice now a chorus of every smile ever collected. "But you're the one who can open it completely. A doctor who understands madness. A son who inherited the ability to see beauty in transformation. A bridge between what we are and what we're becoming." The key in my father's hands grew warm, its carved surfaces flowing like liquid metal. He pressed it into my palm, and I felt the smiles etched into its surface reaching into my flesh, connecting with the mask, completing circuits of joy that ran deeper than bone. Around us, the columned figures, those eternally smiling forms that held up the impossible ceiling, began to move. Their faces turned toward me with synchronized grace, expressions shifting in ways that suggested they weren't just sculptures wearing smiles, but smiles that had grown bodies to wear. It was never about curing them, my father said, his own smile now a window into somewhere else. It was about helping them evolve. Teaching them to smile in ways that could open doors between here and elsewhere. A place where joy isn't confined by the limitations of human faces. The key burned in my hand as understanding flooded through me. Every patient in room 307, every collected smile, every transformation, they were all practice. Preparation. Teaching humanity new ways to express happiness until we could finally express it perfectly enough to attract the attention of something that had been waiting since before we learned to smile. The veins on the walls pulsed faster, their light taking on colors that had no names in human language. They converged into a pattern that was more than just a building-sized smile, it was a blueprint for reality itself, drawn in the architecture of joy stretched beyond breaking. I raised the key, feeling the weight of every smile ever collected guiding my hand. The air grew thick with anticipation, tasting of copper and old memories and possibilities that hadn't happened yet. In the mirror floor beneath my feet, I saw my reflection multiplied infinitely, each version wearing a smile that belonged to someone else, all of them moving in perfect synchronization. "Turn it," Sarah whispered, her form now suggesting something that had never worn flesh. "Turn the key and let everyone smile together. Forever." The lock was everywhere and nowhere, in the air itself, in the spaces between heartbeats, in the geometry of joy pushed past human limits. As I turned the key, I felt reality holding its breath, waiting to exhale into something new. The last thing I heard was the whisper of well-oiled hinges as every door in the hospital opened at once. The last thing I saw was my own reflection, wearing a smile that finally understood its purpose. The last thing I felt was joy, perfect, infectious, eternal joy, as every face in every reflection in every window of every building turned toward the opening door and began to smile. And then we all whispered together. "Sleep." And the world woke up smiling.